Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many names here. I'd say faces, but no, not a lot of faces, but a lot of names, a lot of familiar names. Thanks so much for joining us. Um, got the honor here of filling in the large shoes for Dr. Rumrell today. He's unable to be with us, but I'm going to be presenting the content for the Lunch and Learn webinar, the Retain Kentucky Lunch and Learn webinar number 2 here. In just a second, I'll pull up some slides and we can kind of continue this conversation. Again, pleasure to have everyone here. Really excited to share some of this content with you. Today, we're going to be talking about workplace discrimination against Americans with disabilities, a not so silent epidemic. Again, my name is Michael Leslie. I am the Director of Data and Evaluation here at the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky. I've been working on and off on the Retain project for about 8 years now, and have been a fellow researcher and colleague of my good friend, Dr. Philip Rumrell, who, again, is unable to be with us today, but sends his best regards, and is grateful that you all take the time here to hear about some of the research that's been done in this area. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I think the structure for today is we're going to go through our presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. If you have those, don't feel free to put those in the chat. Don't hesitate to raise a hand. Brandon or Pam, if you get a chance, please let me know if you see anything that I'm missing, a hand or a comment that we can address. But happy to stop and address any questions y'all have as we go through. So one little acknowledgement here and disclaimer is this presentation has been funded by a grant awarded through the United States Department of Labor, i.e. the Retain grant. This product was created by the grantee and does not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Department of Labor. And the DOL makes no guarantees, warranties, or assurances of any kind expressed or implied without respect to such information, including any information on linked sites and including but not limited to the accuracy of the information or its completeness, timeliness, usefulness, adequacy, continued availability, or ownership. So, long before COVID-19, our most recent, very distressful, if you will, run-in with the pandemic, we started something called the National EEOC ADA Research Project, which we endearingly refer to as NEARP. NEARP started in 2003 as a public health research community of practice. This was largely started around Virginia Commonwealth and the work of Dr. Brian McMahon, along with Dr. Rumrell, as a community practice that looks at workplace discrimination as an insidious and un-American virus. Obviously, many of you are probably familiar with the history of the Americans with Disabilities Act, its passage in 1990, and its very, very long journey to implementation. Maybe that's a friendly way of saying that, but certainly it took a long time for implementation of the ADA to not only to take effect, to start being actually implemented, regulated, and there were a lot of obstacles and barriers, including some large Supreme Court decisions. And then we all know kind of the journey to the 2008 ADA Amendments Act. And so all along the way, while we thought, and to some extent it was, this major breakthrough of ADA 1990, workplace discrimination toward Americans with disabilities certainly did not go away overnight. It certainly has persisted in the decades since in various capacities. And so our effort here was to study workplace discrimination allegations and claims that have been made over the past several decades, and look at kind of the breadth of those claims and allegations and the qualities and characteristics of those. So we know that given health and life outcome disparities between employed and unemployed individuals, employment of people with disabilities is a national public health concern. Right? We know that access to employment and employment opportunities unlocks so many factors related to quality of life, whether that be compensation, independent living capacity, access to health insurance and benefits and vacation, a social sense of social connection, a sense of purpose, an existential sense of purpose in your life, right? There are so many things from a mental and physical health perspective that employment and work add to individuals' lives. For individuals that do not have access to employment opportunities, that is a significant public health concern, especially when we see such a uniform restriction of any group of people, as we have with individuals with disabilities historically across the world and in the United States. To the disability community, the American economy and society as a whole are a much healthier place when individuals with disabilities are participating in the labor force. So we know from research that has been done again over the decades that individuals or places of employment, businesses that have an integrated environment are much more productive, and people tend to be much happier, and it creates a really positive workplace culture in general. So all that to say, having an integrated workforce with people with disabilities is certainly a positive thing, and that's been shown to be the case time and time again. Workplace discrimination against people with disabilities is a common threat to labor force participation and therefore a threat to public health. And so we view this very seriously. You can tell by kind of the language we're using here, a little bit of certainly connecting workplace discrimination with an insidious and un-American virus. You can tell how seriously we take this and the way that we view workplace discrimination and the damage that it can do to the general public. And so to eliminate this public health threat, we tend to study it. We try to understand its etiology, the symptoms, the spread, both the protective and inhibiting factors, and its overall impact. And so, again, as NEARP was initiated in 2003, the effort was really to try to understand what's happening, where it's happening, how it's happening, and if we can understand it better, maybe we can do something about it. Maybe we can create interventions and programs and opportunities for us to alleviate some of this burden and to kind of turn things around and move in the right direction. So over the last 20 plus years now, NEARP Collaborative has published over 108 studies. There's been over 100 authors and co-authors from 25 different universities. There have been 12 dissertations completed out of this collaborative slash this data that we have gained access to through the EEOC. There's been over $9 million that has been awarded in research support that has gone to fund studies related to this National EEOC ADA Research Project, or NEARP, as I mentioned before. And there's been various partners involved. Some of the more salient partners that have contributed include, obviously, the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, Kent State University, the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, or the NMSS, the University of Kentucky, Virginia Commonwealth University, or VCU, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So a little bit about the actual database that the EEOC uses to track these allegations or discrimination claims, if you will. It is called the IMS, or Integrated Mission System Database. There are more than 1.3 million unique and closed ADA Title I allegations between 1992 and 2023. So that is well over 3 decades of allegations. So just for context, we know that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is the entity from the federal government that is in charge of adjudicating and examining workplace discrimination claims on the basis of any federal civil rights legislation. So when ADA was passed, it therefore became under the EEOC's purview to do the same with discrimination allegations made under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title I, as many of you know, is the employment title that is within the Americans with Disabilities Act that guarantees Americans with disabilities rights in the employment world to not be discriminated against on the basis of their disability. So if an individual creates or makes an allegation of discrimination on the basis of that disability, that would therefore go to the EEOC under Title I of the ADA. For example, there might be other allegations under the Civil Rights Act that get made that would be under different titles of the Civil Rights Act. But for these specifically with disability, specifically workplace allegations related to disability would be filed under this ADA Title I. And as we know, as I mentioned earlier, the Americans with Disabilities Act may have been passed in 1990, but it didn't go into effectuation until 1992. And so any allegation again made from 1992 to most recently 2023 would be in this database. And again, that's more than 1.3 million unique and closed allegations. If an allegation is still open, it would not be in the database yet. So once it's closed, it is then integrated into the database and released. So what information do we have access to utilizing this IMS system database? So we have what's called charging party characteristics. And so the charging party is the individual making the allegation. We have access to how old they are, their gender, their race, ethnicity, and what type of impairment they have reported as their primary impairment. Most of the time, what you're seeing here is this is the impairment that they're making the allegation related to. So they're saying, if I was discriminated against on the basis of my visual impairment, that would be the impairment type. If I was discriminated against on the basis of my diagnosis of major depressive disorder, that would be the impairment type. If I was discriminated against on the basis of my diagnosis with cancer, that would be the impairment type. Okay. The issues are the types of where essentially what this discrimination was and where it occurred. Okay, so those are 41 actions that are explicitly prohibited under Title I of the ADA, and we have access to all of those different codes. Those are often categorized in broader categories in some of the research that we've done. So for example, we might say in job acquisition, the specific issues under that might be hiring and application procedures and the way that jobs are posted. Working conditions, that might be someone feels like they were discriminated against in the terms of their employment and the benefits they received, they were harassed or intimidated on the job. And then in job retention, that might be specific to they were fired and or discharged, didn't get the promotion they thought that they deserved. They were subject to constructive discharge, or they didn't receive reasonable accommodations that they felt like they were entitled to. We also have access to employer characteristics. That includes how large the employer is, the number of employees at that business, the location, so the state or the region that the physical location of the business was located in, and their industrial classification. So whether it was maybe hospital or it was a worked in the oil and gas industry, etc. Then we also have the outcome of the resolution. We create a binary category here, either merit or non-merit. There are several different kind of subcategories for the resolutions, but we dichotomize that into, was the person's claim found to be merited, or did it receive a non-merit judgment from the EEOC? Now, to be very clear, a non-merit case doesn't necessarily mean that discrimination didn't happen. It just means that it didn't, according to the EEOC, meet the legal threshold that qualifies for discrimination. Certainly that it could be some unfair treatment practices, but it did not meet that legal threshold under Title I of the ADA, according to the EEOC, or there just wasn't enough evidence to result in a merit closure. Sometimes individuals will drop the case because it can be a long and kind of arduous process before it gets to a resolution. And in so those cases, that would be a non-merit, and sometimes their employer can settle with them before the issue gets resolved, and the person will drop the case. So there's a variety of ways that a non-merit resolution may happen. This obviously favors the employer, and it says the allegation of discrimination was not upheld. In some of the research we've done, you might see this referred to as perceived discrimination, versus the merit outcomes. We can say legally discrimination did occur in that scenario. So we say very much real and perceived discrimination. Whether the legal entity finds that it happened or not, the person still experienced that, and it was very real for them. So the NEARP researchers examine the characteristics of the employers and the charging parties, differences in discrimination experience between and within impairment groups. So for example, we published a study looking at the differences between alcohol use disorder and other substance use disorders, right? So we wanted to look at the differences between those groups. Sometimes we will look at the differences within groups. Sometimes we will create a control group, if you will, from impairments that are not characteristically related to ones that we're trying to research, just to kind of have a basis to look at how is this different than what we might say the other discrimination occurring to other groups would be. We look at the issues, so what type of discrimination happened. In some instances, we've looked at what factors for this group predict merit case resolutions, whether that be charging party characteristics or characteristics related to the issue or the employer size, etc. And we also look at those discrimination patterns over time. So something that we found really interesting, that several studies were published, were specifically related to the three eras of the ADA. So we have between its passage and its effectuation in 1992 all the way up to 1998, which was when the first of the large Supreme Court cases that started to limit the federal definition of disability occurred. That's the Sutton decision there. And so then we have a period of around 5 years there, 6 years. Then we have from 1998 to 2008, which was we call that post-Sutton era, from when the Sutton decision occurred to all the way up to 2008 when the ADA Amendments Act was passed. So that was a period of a very limited view and decision on what qualified as a disability and what kind of protections individuals had. And then we have the post-ADA Amendments Act era, which was from 2008 all the way up to present day, in which the definition of disability was expanded back to what people viewed as the original intent of the ADA, and those Supreme Court decisions that had limited the definition of disability were both several of them were reversed, and individuals with disabilities tended to have much more protection. So I want to go over a handful of important findings and discuss this, and share this with you all. Again, if anybody has any questions up to this point, please feel free to throw those in the chat. I haven't seen anything yet, or raise your hand, and I'll try to be monitoring that as well. So one finding was that I mentioned the three eras of ADA. We had the initial era, which implementation was very delayed and there was a big lag. And so not a lot of people knew exactly what their rights were. And if they did know about them, not everybody knew about how they might even make an allegation if they felt like they'd been subject to workplace discrimination. And then by the time people started to realize what was out there and what their rights were, we sort of had the Sutton Act, and people started to have rights, their rights as an individual or an American with a disability diminish over the next decade there. And so once the ADA Amendments Act overturned those Supreme Court cases and those decisions and opened up that definition, broadened that definition, many legal professionals were anticipating that there would just be this massive flood of allegations. Everybody's going to know about their rights, and people are just going to be inundated with. In some cases, people said these egregious lawsuits that individuals with disabilities would be filing, and it would just be burdening the system and overwhelming the system. That didn't happen. What we found according to the data, was there was a very slow and steady increase since 2009 after the ADA Amendments Act was passed. This is a very similar pattern to what was observed in employment allegations under the Civil Rights Act in 65. So we saw that gradually people became more aware, and that number increased over time as that awareness kind of spread and the awareness of the systems and the mechanisms that people had access to be able to report those discrimination experiences were available. What we know is an employer with about over 1,000 employees, and that represents around 2% of employers, has a 1 in 4,800 risk of being named in an ADA Title I allegation in any given year. So that's a relatively low risk for most large employers. So it's just not the threat that some legal professionals and pundits thought that this would be. What we do know is also that those allegations slowed during the first waves of COVID-19. So if you want to look at kind of peak number of allegations, you look into the late 2010s, that 2016, 17, 18, 19, we saw kind of a more dramatic increase in the number of allegations that were being filed, which doesn't necessarily speak to our societal advance, right? It doesn't speak to the fact that we've gotten way better at preventing workplace discrimination for people with disabilities over time. It probably just speaks to awareness and general public knowledge of these systems and individual civil rights. So allegations slowed pretty dramatically with the first waves of the COVID-19 pandemic, mostly due to societal shutdowns and a lot of folks leaving the workforce. Sometimes that's referred to as the Great Resignation. Yeah, John. Jonathan said he hadn't seen the Great Resignation used before. But yeah, which was picking up steadily in 2022 and 2023. Important finding number 2. There are 41 issues that someone could allege discrimination in regard to. 84% of them, so a vast majority of them, come from only 5 issues. Number 1, over a third of the allegations are related to discharge or firing. Okay. So that is obviously people being let go in their view unfairly from their job. And again, in their view, it happened on the basis of their disability. So an individual feels like they were let go from their work because their disability, because of their impairment. Reasonable accommodation, that makes up around 1/5 of the allegations, or 19%. That is, somebody feels like they were entitled to and did not receive appropriate accommodations on the basis of their disability. 11% of allegations are related to hiring. That is, somebody alleges that they were not hired for a job on the basis of their impairment and or disabling condition diagnosis. Next, the fourth highest is terms and conditions, and that's 10% of allegations. And that is somebody feels like that their employer violated the terms and conditions of their employment on the basis of or due to their disability. And lastly, or equal to terms and conditions here, the fifth largest, another 10% is harassment and intimidation. And that is individuals feel like they were harassed or intimidated on the workplace because of their condition, because of their disability. That could be from a boss, from a supervisor, from coworkers, from the business in and of itself. So a variety of different angles that could come in, but they were either harassed or intimidated on the basis of that disability. Again, 5 issues. I would argue 2 really large chunks would be the discharge and reasonable accommodation, but those 5 issues make up 84% of all allegations in this database. Finding number 3, employers tend to prevail at a 3-to-1 ratio. In other words, individuals only receive a merit resolution to the allegation they make around 1/4 or 25% of the time. The exact rate over the course of those 30 years is 24%. So a non-merit resolution rate, therefore, of over 3/4 or 76%. There has been some variation over time. That number, the merit resolution rate, was lower pre-ADA Amendments Act, that is pre-2008, especially between the Sutton decision and the ADA Amendments Act, that is between 1998 and 2008, the merit resolution rate was particularly low. And so if memory serves, up to 2008, I believe the merit resolution rate was right at or just below 20%. So I believe it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 19%. And then if you just look at the allegations post ADA Amendments Act, where the definition of disability was expanded and disability rights, for all intents and purposes, were therefore expanded, we saw that jump up to closer to 30%, right? That number climbed up 27, 28% merit resolution rate. And so on average, over the course of all three of those quote unquote ADA eras, we see an average merit resolution rate of 24%. We also know that there are certain groups that tend to have higher merit rates than other groups. Two of those groups specifically are those with sensory conditions, so individuals with hearing loss, and or those individuals in the deaf community, and those with visual impairments and or those who are in the identify as blind, tend to have the highest merit rates. That's approximately 30% each. We did an article several years ago that looked specifically at individuals who had hearing loss versus individuals who had visual impairments, and those allegations that they made under Title I of the ADA. Turns out they have a lot in common in terms of the characteristics of the allegations they make and their merit resolution rate under the ADA and under this from the EEOC. We also know that individuals that tend to have the more stigmatized conditions tend to have the lowest merit rates, which is not entirely surprising. So the lowest group that we were able to find in our studies is substance use disorders at 18%. Other groups that are relatively low include individuals with mental health diagnoses, those, especially the ones that tend to be more stigmatized, things like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. And we also know that individuals with other highly stigmatized conditions, such as like individuals diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, those individuals tend to have really low merit rates as well. And so if you can think of a condition that tends to be more highly stigmatized, those are usually acquired conditions to where the public or people generally perceive them to be at fault for that condition, tend to be invisible conditions, ones that are more episodic in nature. Those are kind of the triumvirate, if you will, of stigma for conditions. And to no surprise, individuals with those most stigmatized conditions tend to have the lowest merit rates for allegations they make. The fourth important finding here is that charging parties with intellectual disabilities, brain injuries, and hearing loss tend to have the highest rates of harassment and intimidation. Certainly, you could make some inferences, and I would imagine a lot of you, the wheels are spinning. Why would individuals with brain injuries, intellectual disabilities, or hearing loss tend to have the highest rates of harassment and intimidation? The database does not let us look for causation there, but I think that you could reach some very logical conclusions about why that might be. Certainly, our best guess is that individuals that have difficulty with communication, individuals that sometimes have difficulty with reading comprehension, which, given some of the impacts of intellectual disabilities or different types of brain injuries, those cognitive difficulties that people might experience certainly cause individuals, coworkers, supervisors to, in some cases, harass and intimidate them and treat them poorly on the basis of those concerns or those impairments that person might experience. We think individuals with hearing loss A lot of it comes to do with like that communication barrier that they have oftentimes in the workplace, and the way individuals tend to be treated, um, and discussed and talked about. And people don't always realize that just because someone can't hear doesn't mean they can't see what you're saying or how you're treating them or the facial expressions that they're receiving from you. And so they tend to be harassed and even intimidated in the workplace quite often. Individuals with substance use disorders and mental health conditions or diagnoses tend to have the highest rates of discharge allegations. Again, invisible, oftentimes episodic issues, or conditions, very highly stigmatized. No surprise that people tend to fire these individuals at higher rates. And oftentimes the person perceives that it was on the basis of their disabling condition that they were fired. And oftentimes, my guess is they're probably right. That somebody was trying to find a way to let go of them because they didn't want to deal with it, or they don't know how to deal with it, or there may be some fear connected to finding out a person has a diagnosis, and the business, the employer is trying to find a way to push them out, and ends up letting them go. And the person very much feels like they had been fired unjustly on the basis of a protected condition. Charging parties with speech impairments, burns, and amputations and disfigurement tend to have highest rates of hiring allegations. Again, I think that you can logically conclude for a variety of reasons why that might be. If you think about the interview process, individuals with speech impairments or impediments, individuals who have burns, amputations, and different types of disfigurement, oftentimes in a face-to-face interview, those things will be visible, right? And in the terms of speech impairment, it would be obvious within the interview process. And so individuals feel like they're not hired, or they get some type of rude remark or facial expression or comment that somebody makes within the interview process that would lead them to believe that they did not get the job on the basis of one of those conditions, or at least they would perceive that they were not getting the job on the basis of that characteristic or condition that they might have. And so we see the highest rates of hiring allegations related to those. Again, relatively logical, understandable. Lastly, charging parties with chronic health conditions tend to have the highest rates of reasonable accommodation allegations. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts related to that. I think our best guess is that sometimes those chronic health conditions can be episodic. They can exacerbate over time. And as they exacerbate, people might have more requests for different accommodations. They might need a flexible work schedule. They might need extended days off due to needing to go get treatment. So if you're an individual with cancer, maybe you're undergoing chemotherapy, you need to take a window of time off for treatment. We've done a lot of research just based on Dr. Rumrill's involvement with research on multiple sclerosis and engagement with the National Multiple Sclerosis Society on individuals with MS. I think that you can look at them kind of as a case study here as a chronic health condition. What happens is often people with MS, as many of you know, might have relapses of symptoms. So they go through a period of relapse and remission where their symptoms are almost non-existent, or maybe totally non-existent for weeks or months at a time. And then they might have a relapse of symptoms where they have very significant symptomology for a period of time. And that might mean they have to take some time off, or they need significant accommodations during that time when they're having symptoms. Again, those episodic conditions can be really tough for employers. They, for whatever reason, have a really hard time wrapping their head around, hey, you don't need these accommodations most of the time, but then all of a sudden you need them. Do you really need them? Are you quote unquote milking it? Are you trying to ask for more than you need? Do you really need this many days off? And so it really just becomes somebody maybe not trusting or not showing a regard for somebody and what they're saying that they're going through, and not wanting to provide that maybe additional level of accommodation to them that they might need. Again, maybe they just feel like it's unreasonable. You're asking for too many days off. We can't have you working from home that many days or that often, or maybe it's we need you outside, and if you're someone with MS, maybe there's a temperature sensitivity and you can't go outside on certain days because you're having flare-ups, and that becomes an issue. And so ultimately, the people don't feel like they're getting the accommodations they need, and they bring an allegation on the basis of that to the EEOC. Lastly, there seems to be a very significant mitigating impact of labor unions on allegations. Now, remember that some individuals that actually work for labor unions might make an ADA Title I allegation against their labor union. And so that is also a possibility if they feel like they're not only their business or employer, but also the union that they belong to could have discriminated against them. But that notwithstanding, um, individuals who live in labor states or labor union states, those non-right to work states, what we call union security states, tend to have many fewer allegations than the right to work states, or the states that have done a lot to kind of diminish the power of labor unions across those states. So for every 188 Title I allegations in union security states, there are 160 allegations in right to work states. So what that tells us is that there's a mitigating impact of labor unions on disability discrimination allegations that are made within that state. Now, there's a variety of potential explanations here. It could just be that instead of making an allegation, a person will talk to their representative at their union, and that person takes care of that and mediates that process between them and maybe the business that they're currently working for. And they don't feel like they need to get the EEOC involved. And so maybe it's just in that kind of mediation process that exists within a lot of labor unions that prevents those allegations from being made. Or it's possible that certainly the rights and the work conditions that have been established on the basis of a labor union and the maybe collective bargaining agreement, etc., just creates an environment where that's less likely to happen, where people are just more cognizant of the way that they're treating folks, and they're more aware of their rights, and so they tend not to violate those or discriminate on the basis of those things. And it very well, there's a number of other factors that could be involved here, and the likelihood is the truth is that it's probably a combination of all of those things. Some of the more recent NEARP studies or in progress studies that exist include, I mentioned one that looks at both hearing loss and vision loss, comparing and contrasting those two conditions, looking at discrimination allegations against individuals with or made by individuals with multiple sclerosis in different age groups, looking at learning disabilities versus other disabilities. We know that especially young folks with learning disabilities tend not to ask for accommodations, tend to get have a really low employment rate. And so we wanted to look at kind of what may be happening there in terms of workplace discrimination. Looking at age and cancer. That's really an interesting one, especially the kind of long effects of cancer that it has on the body, even for people that are cancer survivors. And so we kind of look at the long impact of different issues that they have in the workplace and allegations that they've made. Looking at pre and post ADA Amendments Act, we have one specifically that we looked at with multiple sclerosis, looking at alcohol use and other substance use disorders. So you would say drug use disorder and alcohol use disorder, comparing and contrasting the two. Looking at some of those mental health conditions, specifically anxiety and stress disorders versus other conditions, seeing what's unique about them. We have been gradually publishing a series of 5 regional profiles. Um, and so within that, uh, we are looking at what is happening in different regions. So we looked at the Northeast and New England together and kind of contrasted the two. We looked at the Midwest and the Great Plains, the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast, the Southwest, and then also the Pacific and Northwest. So we kind of profiled the region, the Mountain West and the Southwest are connected together there, and then the Pacific Northwest and the West, the Pacific Rim there, are all looked at together. And so we examined profiles across those different areas, looked at rankings for states and types of merit resolutions and types of issues and the most common disability types that we're making allegations. So there's some really interesting data in there, in looking at how different and or uniform different regions are. So for example, something we found was that New York and New Jersey have almost identical profiles, and all of the New England states have almost identical profiles. What's interesting is New England and New York, New Jersey, so the Northeast, if you will, and New England have very different profiles from one another. So there are some very distinct differences in the way workplace allegations come up between those two regions, despite them being very geographically close to one another. Experience of workers with long COVID, and long COVID since 2021 has been a presumptive disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So examining that and looking at what's happening with that as well is a recent / in progress study. So what do we know, or what do we think about what's happening? How do we treat this if again, this proverbial virus that is workplace discrimination against people with disabilities? What are some of the conclusions that we've been able to draw from all of the 100 plus studies that have been done in this area? One thing seems like labor unions are really protective, are able to educate and advocate for the workers. And so what can we learn from that intervention that is seemingly been very effective, that labor unions have been able to enact in those union security states? We know that a strong job person match can be really vitally important. So being disconnected from the labor force is extremely has an extremely negative impact on one's overall well-being. However, being engaged in work in a situation where you're being actively discriminated against can be even worse for somebody than being unemployed. So if you put somebody in a really bad situation just for the sake of getting a job and they're harassed, the power, if you know, knowing and understanding the kind of the construct, if you will, of discrimination, when there is a significant power differential, that discrimination can have a even more profound impact. And so, you know, if you're experiencing discrimination at the workplace, the profoundness of that impact can be very large reaching for individuals who are experiencing it. And oftentimes there is an inherent power differential in experiencing workplace discrimination. And so we want to be very careful that we're not just shoving people into jobs that are really poor fits, where they are going to experience workplace discrimination without setting up the appropriate supports in that workplace and making sure that they have natural in-place supports in that arena. So utilizing job person match, selecting jobs that are well within the person's skills and abilities, hopefully, and we believe that doing due diligence up front and putting somebody in a good situation can go a very long way in making sure that they don't experience the level of workplace discrimination that some people unfortunately experience in the American workplace. And so hopefully doing your due diligence and setting people up, hopefully for success, by finding good matches is important. Receiving assistance from state VR agencies. We know that a lot of folks with disabilities don't know about the availability of these services. We know that these services can be really profound in assisting people and finding that match and understanding their rights and advocating for themselves and understanding how to navigate the workplace and helping them set up supports within the workplace that could prevent these things from happening. Um, we've worked a lot with businesses. Businesses are really interested in how do we stop this, right? They don't want to be known as a place that's discriminating against anybody for anything. They want to be known as an integrative, inclusive workplace for the most part. Many businesses know that there are moral and financial reasons why it is very good for them to be known as inclusive, integrated workplaces. And so they want to be proactive in trying to examine the potential for these issues and head them off, kind of nip them in the bud, if you will, and stop discrimination before it occurs. And so we've done a lot of education and training with businesses based on what we've learned from this. And we found that a lot of them really do want to be proactive and they don't want this stuff happening in their workplace. They want an inclusive, integrated workforce because they understand the value in the culture and also the value it brings in terms of productivity and across the board for them. So consulting with employers regarding workplace supports, specifically for people with specific disabilities and other ADA implementation matters can be really important. It's great to see so many places taking this very seriously and wanting to know how do we be proactive, how do we prevent this from happening. Education and advocacy within the disability community. We've learned that it seems like certain disability groups are more aware of their rights than other groups. And so just from kind of some qualitative research that has kind of gone beyond what we've been able to see quantitatively here in the database, we've seen like, for example, we did some research with individuals who were diagnosed with HIV/AIDS and a follow-up study to one that was done in the mid 2000s on what was happening in terms of their workplace allegations. What we found that they seemed to really have a strong grasp on they were educated and they knew what their rights were. And they were making allegations that nobody else was making in terms of like 0.01% of allegations are posting notices, right? But they knew that group of individuals knew that that was one of their rights and that was something the workplace needed to do. And they were making allegations and reporting their employers for not doing stuff that a lot of people aren't even aware is one of those 41 issues under the ADA. And so we've learned kind of that those individuals in certain groups tend to be more educated and understand that better. So we want to make, the disability community is not some type of homogenous uniform group, right? We know that there are very much lots of silos. There are lots of different individual, independent communities out there that discuss things, that have support groups, that have advocacy groups. We want to kind of reach out broadly and help educate and help them understand what advocacy can be done with regard to this workplace discrimination that's occurring. Assistive technology, extremely important in enhancing job performance, reducing potential discrimination issues. Universal design is something that's extremely important. If you're able to universally design a workplace as much as possible, that certainly cuts down on the potential for this type of workplace discrimination to occur. Utilizing these amazing websites we have, like the Job Accommodation Network, the ADA Centers National Network, and in providing legal assistance and redress for discrimination as it occurs. I think all very important. What I would say is it's very difficult. Some people want to come to us on the basis of this project and say, hey, how do we help somebody make a workplace discrimination claim? And that might be what you want to do. But we also want to be really cautious because people don't get these resolved in their favor very often. It's very difficult to prove that this happened. And to reach what we say is the quote unquote legal threshold for workplace discrimination is not easy. And so you want to make sure the person you're talking with is very aware and they've probably exhausted all their other options at negotiating and going through kind of mediation with their employer before they make one of these allegations. because unfortunately, the reality is the chances of them getting a merit resolution in their favor are very low, just naturally, regardless of how strong a case somebody feels like they might have. And it's extremely unfortunate, but that's the reality. And so instead of putting somebody through a multi-year process, if there's a way that you can work with the employer and get it addressed instead of having to elevate it to this level, might actually be the way to go. And again, it kind of pains me to say that because I wish we had a system where people felt like they were getting a just treatment, and that if they were really being discriminated against and they perceived that they were getting things that resolutions that were in line with what they perceived to be happening, and that's just not the case. And so, in light of that, I think it's really important that we work with folks and help them understand what the process is probably going to be like, and help them understand that, there may be other options to resolve a case and to maybe use elevating something to EEOC as a last resort if you feel like you've exhausted all your other options, but to be aware that it still might be likely that even if you actually have experienced discrimination, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a merit resolution in your favor, unfortunately. That doesn't mean that it's not a fight worth fighting, but we just want people to be very aware of the system and the processes before they get started, and so they have realistic expectations of what might happen. So with that, really appreciate your all's time. Appreciate you coming out to this second return lunch and learn webinar. Happy to answer any questions or to take any comments from anybody who has some thoughts or maybe some insights from the work that you do into something that you've seen related to workplace discrimination and this process of filing an allegation to the EEOC.
Um, Michael, you may have addressed this, but is there, and I may have missed it, but you had mentioned how long a process it is, and even with a really strong case, you're not guaranteed a finding in your favor.
Yeah.
What percentage of cases do get found in the person's favor overall?
Yeah, so 24% is the average across that 30 plus year span, Harold. And so 24% of cases get found in favor of the charging party that made the allegation. That again, that has raised pretty significantly over the last 20 years. Up through the ADA Amendments Act, it was closer to 18, 19%. And since the ADA Amendments Act in 2008 went into effect in 2009, it has increased closer to 30%. It's been up, and again, it depends on the condition. Like I mentioned, like some conditions have a much higher rate of merit resolution than others. Like for example, like mentioned substance use disorders, mental health conditions, some other things, they have really low rates of merit resolution. So those ones that tend to be the most stigmatized also tend to get the lowest rates of merit resolutions when they make these allegations. And so generally speaking, overall for all conditions across all periods of time here, 24%, but depending on the time period and the condition, it varies pretty dramatically.
Okay, and you also gave, a number of really, I thought, really important findings in terms of like, the people who experience harassment or people with intellectual disabilities and communication um, traumatic brain injury and think hearing loss and things of that sort. Um, but in terms of overall for all disabilities, and again, I apologize if I've missed this, if you're looking at like findings of hiring or getting accommodations or of harassment or whatever, where is the greatest percentage of case, in terms of those broad areas where
Yeah,
complaints can be filed, where is the largest percentage?
great question, Harold. And so there's five issues, the biggest issues that make up 84% of all allegations. And the biggest one is discharge. So firing, that makes up about a third. The next biggest one, which makes up almost 20%, is reasonable accommodations. So
Mhm.
someone filing on the basis of a reasonable accommodation. The next three after that, I think is around 12%, 10%, and 10%. And those are terms and condition, harassment, intimidation, and hiring. Hiring, I think, is around 11 or 12%, and then 10% for harassment, intimidation, 10% for terms and conditions. I, Go ahead, Harold. I think I saw someone throw a question in the chat. I want to make sure. Someone mentioned, do you have a breakdown of merit versus non-merit outcomes based on gender? Do I have that on hand? I don't have it on hand, Elizabeth. It's a great question. I can tell you for sure that the research that I've been involved in personally, which a lot of the stuff I've done has been related to substance use and mental health conditions, is we find pretty consistently that individuals who identify as male tend to have a higher likelihood of merit outcome. It's not dramatic, but it is slight. They do have a slightly higher rate of merit outcomes. So there is some potential there for us trying to figure out is there some intersectionality here of gender discrimination and disability characteristic discrimination that's happening? Probably to some extent. It doesn't seem to be massive, but the other thing, Elizabeth, that's really interesting is that it's not only just the rate of merit, but it's also the sheer number of allegations. Depending on the condition, in some conditions, we would expect people in the workforce are relatively split, male and female, with this condition in the workforce. People sometimes one gender over the other tends to make way more allegations on the basis of that condition than the other gender, right? Which is interesting. We think that that's very much a case by case basis. For example, if it's like a physical condition, we know that traditionally speaking, generally speaking, males tend to work in jobs that are slightly more physically demanding. And so maybe if it's a physical condition, even though there might be an equal number of male and female individuals with this condition in the workforce, there's more allegations from males because maybe they tend to be more proportionally involved in jobs that require more physical labor, right? So there's little things like that that come up, but it's very interesting and it plays out differently based on the condition, interestingly enough. Great question. And Harold, thank you as well. Great questions. And again, thanks everyone. Appreciate the feedback and the comments. Reading through them right now. Thank you all for the feedback. Any other questions or comments before we kind of wrap it up and log off here? I believe that Pam just put in the chat, for those of you that are really enjoying this series, the next Lunch and Learn will be January 28th at noon Eastern Time. Myths and facts about hiring and retaining workers with disabilities. So please, if you get a chance, tune in for that. It's going to be a great one. Really appreciate, again, you all coming out to this and your appreciation. Any feedback you have for us would be greatly appreciated as we want to continue to make these better and continue to bring these to you. So thank you all. Hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Appreciate your time, and hopefully you pick something up that you're able to take away and make a little difference in your own arena wherever you're working in. So appreciate it.